So I'm just going to go ahead and start this off unlike I normally do. This review is going to be a little rough in the sense that I'm not going to be having fun. Normally, even with my really bad books, I have fun with the review section that follows. Even if the book angers me, even if the book is really boring, even if I just really did not like the book. I've never really gotten so angry that I can't have fun mocking it. Orc and Her Bride, for example. Elkith angered me to the point that it interrupted my sleep schedule. Throughout her book, her bratty attitude just frustrated me to no ends. But I enjoyed making the review, and the book itself wasn't unforgivable because of that. It was just too far in one direction that the author was trying to do. There was also The Last Layover. I got genuinely upset by a couple chapters within the book, but overall, I had fun making my mocking review of it. This book is going to be an exception. I was genuinely disgusted by this book when the time rolled around that I finally finished reading it. And I'm not really going to get deep into why at this moment. Trust me, there's going to be a lot of trigger warnings, and I'm just going to warn you now. You see, I had a lot of fun plans for this book. Okay, so to give a quick recap. Initially this week, I was supposed to be reviewing City of the Dead, but I found out that it was a sequel. Now, I would normally still just kind of power through it and see if it makes sense on its own. But unfortunately, this was a Devil May Care kind of sequel. While you might have been able to defend it to not catering to a new reader who hadn't read what come before, you can't even really defend it because it doesn't even try to remind you of things. Reading the first 20 pages, there was nothing in the sequel that gave me even a grasp of who the characters were or what was going on beyond the very bare basics. The book just throws everything at you as if you leaped from the first book straight into this one, as if no time had passed in between reading them. So naturally speaking, I thought it was going to be a fun idea to do this. See, I went on Kindle, I picked up the first book, and I read through it with plans to read the first book now, release the review today, then dive into the second book, which I would release Friday. So I would compare the two back to back and still fulfill my actual TBR read. I was even going to have this fun running joke on my channel where, because as you can see, I no longer have my beard, I had to shave it for my new job, and I genuinely don't like how I look without it. So I was going to have this running joke where I would put on this fake beard from all of my reviews from now on and refuse to acknowledge any questions about it, until such a time that I could regrow my own, either from a new job or say I get remote work finally or something like that. Unfortunately, all these plans were dashed as I actually read through this first book, because this book is so disgusting and it summoned that deep, primal rage inside me that not only did I barely finish this first book, it was so bad I refused to read the second book. All sense of fun and enjoyment I was going to have in this review just got sucked out the longer I read. And coming on here and talking about the things I'm going to talk about just felt wrong to do while also trying to have fun and make jokes in my standard way. I'm even trying to keep my dogs more calm than they normally are. So again, I'm just going to warn you now. This is going to be a very heavy review. I'm dropping the standard formula I got. I'm just going to open with the trigger warnings that I'm going to have to heavily discuss later on. If these trigger warnings sound like they'd be too much for you, it might be wise just to skip this review altogether. For the next 10 seconds, take a look at these trigger warnings and decide. So let's get started. Now, this zombie work is written by Brian Keene and published in 2003. However, the edition I read is actually known as the author's preferred edition. And by the word of the acknowledgement inside, was re-edited 10 years later, including scenes that Keene was originally forced to edit out. Now, since I didn't read the original work, I can't tell you what scenes that was. Though if I had to take a guess, one of them was probably where a woman got a golden shower after being AR'd. And it's rather graphic descriptions, but let's not get carried away just yet. Normally, this is where I go into books' merits and show you the report card or others' opinions as well as some miscellaneous information, so that you can decide based on both that information and my own whether or not you want to dive into this book. But I'm just going to skip that, because I honestly don't care what others thought of this book, nor do I care that it somehow won an award. I hate this book. I genuinely despise it. So I don't recommend anyone going out to read this book. Now, to be fair, when it first started, that wasn't entirely the case. I was actually somewhat intrigued and interested. Unlike the beginning pages of the sequel, this one seemed more tightly woven and ready to tell a story. We have interesting characters to follow, like Jim, Frankie, and even Martin. They add an interesting mix and, sort of sounds like a bad joke. A survivalist, a pastor, and a drug-addicted whore walk into a bar. In addition, the zombie outbreak itself has some potential to be rather unique compared to the average zombie. The zombies aren't actually caused by some kind of virus. It is just kind of a supernatural threat. Almost seems like it comes from another dimension, which comes over and possesses corpses and then wants to destroy humanity. They aren't fighting with mindless undead corpses that meander about. These things are sapient and smart, to a degree, and capable of using guns, tactics, and even driving vehicles, thus meaning they're a much more dangerous and active threat to your standard shamblers. In a sense, it's much more like the movie The Crazies versus The Walking Dead. But the longer I read, the cracks began to form a little bit. One notable thing seems to be that Keene couldn't seem to decide how these possessions work. It can for sure infect humans and animals, but he seems to repeatedly change his mind on the book if zombies can possess insects too. To piggyback off this point, another issue I started to have is Keene himself created a world where there is very little hope, thus inducing audience apathy. There's a reason darkness-induced audience apathy was a trope, or I guess now it's called Too Bleak Stopped Caring. It's been a while since I've kept up on the tropes, but because zombies can be human and animal, there's really no hope to a world where heroes can learn to live around it or just survive somewhat comfortably. Honestly, to be perfectly pedantic, there's no way this world works where humanity hasn't been wiped out already, as due to the sheer amount of humans and animals that are now undead, the living would be vastly outnumbered. I mean, the idea of animals turning on us alone is enough of a concept that Patterson was able to write his own apocalyptic novel involving that. And then you add in humans turning, and maybe insects, and just in general, it's just awful. Now, I know zombie animals aren't too uncommon in zombie media, but most of the time, authors and they most commonly show up in video games as far as I'm aware. But there's a reason they tend to limit that. Specifically, they only tend to limit that to predator animals. Typically, when you see zombie animals, it would be like zombie wolves or very commonly zombie bears. And that's because they're big, tough animals. And they add a sense of danger that your average zombie wouldn't. But they don't really... The Keene, I will give him credit, goes all in on the idea. You see zombie squirrels, zombie mice, zombie rats, zombie birds. And like I said, it gets to a point where I don't know how humanity is supposed to survive, because how are you supposed to survive in a world where literally everything wants to kill you? Animals, insects, and other humans that have been infected. The dialogue is also super juvenile. Honestly, this whole book reads like it was written by that super edgy weirdo in high school who sits in the back of the class and you're somewhat worried is starting to take inspiration from Randy Stair. Look it up if you don't know what I'm talking about. But to focus on the dialogue in specific, it does that thing where it feels like an author's trying to be more adult by just having his characters swear more. And in general, even apart from this makes it look like his 13-year-old kid had to go on his computer and he just forgot to edit all that stuff out. It also just kind of ruins it. Good cussing using sparingly can impart emphasis on certain scenes or actions or even, dialogue. A good example is, a heavily comedic series called Dragon Ball Z Abridged. There's only 2 uncensored swears in the original works, and both times they're left in purely to emphasize the gravity of a situation in those brief spots where they more seriously adapt the work.
I'm sorry.
Oh wow, we are fucked.
In addition, the longer the story goes on, the more it drops the originality of its premise with the zombies, and just sort of falls back on standard zombie fiction tropes. And while I'm sure there might be some excuse for this book being published in 2003 to say that maybe they weren't as overused then, it still ditches its original premises to go back to the things everyone else is doing. I mean, you got it all. You got a cross-country road trip where our main hero meets a variety of people along the way, the super evil military that are evil to the point that it is literally comic, and then it pisses you off. The tragic scene where after being forced to mercy kill a loved one, someone turns a gun on themselves in grief. You really could make a drinking game and end up dead by the end of it, and not come back. Also, this book suffers from an antagonistic overload. What I mean by that is there's too many villains. Now, the reason zombie fiction often uses the trope that humans are the real monsters is because zombies aren't intelligent enough to be active threats. Zombies, in most works of fiction, is a force of nature sort of evil. An ever-present threat that prevents you from ever being relaxed or, truly safe, but can easily be circumvented if you're smart or quick enough. They're the catalyst for the way the world is now, but they fall into the passive threat category. They'll kill and they'll eat you, but not out of any source of maliciousness or evil. They're no more evil than a regular animal. They operate purely on instinct. As I pointed out in my Rotten Rune review, this was the interesting premise that Mayberry approached with his character's philosophy, talking about how you can't really hate zombies because they're not evil. They can't be evil. They aren't smart enough to be evil. And that's why you typically introduced human antagonists, because they take the role of active threats. They're constantly challenging our heroes and often create the circumstances our heroes have to overcome beyond the normal. They're generally considered evil because they have the capacity for it. They operate out of malice and sadism because that's what they enjoy or that's what they believe is necessary. They're more of a threat to our heroes because they can think and overcome simple obstacles that the zombies can't. You can't just bash one in the head and they go away. I mean, you can, but it's not that easy. With Keene World, zombies are active threats. They can think, they can set ambushes, and they can even form attack plans. He didn't need to do the human antagonists to compensate because they weren't force of natures. I mean, they are, but not to the degree of being a passive threat. They don't offer anything to our story that wouldn't have otherwise been fulfilled by the zombies, and as such feel gratuitous to the plot as they come in and do even more evil things. The only type of thing they can offer is giving us a new type of evil to be horrified at. A bit like if you watched a man get killed, but then have to turn around and watch another man get tortured, then killed. Because of that, the book feels like it's overloading you with antagonists, and just feels more gratuitous the more it tries to balance this act. There's also subtle signs that this book is mildly racist. I'm not going to go out on a limb and scream racist writing, but it is notable that the only characters of color are all preachers, prostitutes, and drug dealers. Now, you might argue one or two, but these are the only colors that is specifically commented on. Oh, and there's a lot of racist language in there, but I don't get the impression that Keene means them as to be glorified, but because typically the bad guys are using it, but really, it all comes down to this. The next part is the part that I'm really going to talk about, and it's going to have that really heavy subject material. Again, keep in mind the trigger warning below. As much as horror isn't my genre, I'm perfectly aware of the standard tropes and natures of horror. One such is that female characters are often utilized in certain unsavory ways, and that horrors involving them tend to go down specific routes. I've talked about this before in many reviews before, the most recent of which, and fairly close to what I'm about to go into, is Firefly's Magnificent Nine. It's, in my opinion, one of the most deplorable acts any human could commit against another human being. And in stories like this, it is often used to sell just how far society has really fallen, or just how evil our human antagonists really are. I may not read a lot of zombie books, but I have played a lot of zombie games and movies, and so I'm aware how often this specific vile act appears. I would even go on to say that there are many works that do use it in this way that I greatly enjoy. The Last of Us, for example. That uses it properly. This book sets a new standard of low when it comes to its usage. I've only read one other work in my time as a reader in general that so poorly utilizes this subject matter that even seeing memes of it causes my blood pressure to rise through the roof. There was even a point near the beginning of my channel where I was going to review a book that utilized the subject in such a poor manner in such a disgusting way that I DNF'd the book entirely. But really, this book just kind of takes the cake when it comes to the horrible amount of sexual assault within this book. Or rape. It's not even sexual assault. It is flat out rape. I legitimately cannot think of a single section in this book where a female character is in it that does not also contain at least one reference to a woman being raped or having been raped in the past. Like, I was willing to let it slide when it came to Frankie, as this was meant to really sell how hard her life had been as a heroin addict since about the age of 14. There was at least some precedent in the book to hyper-focus on it the way it did. It was extremely uncomfortable, and I think it could have done better, but there was at least a reason you could argue that Keene was focusing on it so much. But it just keeps going and going and going. Every time you think this book has hit a new low, it sinks even further. I really don't know how to go into this section while keeping my temper. In fact, I was so close to just foregoing a script altogether and just making this a 20-minute long rant video about this specific point in general. But I realized it wouldn't be fair to you as my readers to see me foaming at the mouth like a rabid bulldog at a book. So I did my best to organize my thoughts with the script. But frankly, what else can I say? The overemphasis on sexual assault in this book doesn't make me sit back and think, oh no, what a horrible world, as I'm sure Keene is trying to go for. But rather it makes me just kind of like sidelong glance at Keene, the same way you give a friend after they say something shockingly fucked up. Like my previous statement about it being every single section involving a female character is not a hyperbole. Anytime a female character is around, it seems like the most disgusting type of sexual predators literally fucking emerge from the woodwork. I'm not kidding. Literally out of nowhere, they'll just pop up. It happens in this book. But the worst of it happens by the time you get to the National Guard, because Keene starts throwing out logic simply so he can talk about have even more rape women suffer. I mean, Keene's grasp on logic was already somewhat hazy, as he's apparently one of those people who believes that cow udders will actually explode if they're not milked. But this defies explanation. Every single woman that is brought in by the National Guard are immediately tossed into sexual slavery. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about this. This includes children. And basically, anytime the jackass is on in duty, they're in the meat wagon getting their rocks off on these women, which throws out the logic that these men can't possibly be arrested in the slightest. I'm also personally offended as a man by the idea that Keene seems to think that we're all sex-addled maniacs that would literally do anything to have sex with a woman, considering how often men try to force women into this position. But for the worst of it, I had given up on this book doing anything good with this well before this point, but it took all of my effort not to throw my phone in disgust when I got to page 237. This was where, for some reason, in the midst of not only escorting their slaves to a new location while under constant assault from zombies, including zombie children, zombie birds, zombie everything, some jackass decides he's gonna go and violently rape a 14-year-old child. And unfortunately, we are given a graphic description of the act. It does no logic to the scene. Like I said, The Last of Us. I brought up The Last of Us for a reason. It did something somewhat similar, and did it way better. The whole scene with Ellie, I really don't want to spoil too much, but the whole scene with Ellie when she's off by her own after trying to get Joel his medicine and getting captured by that group after they find her. This is somewhat similar, but they approach that subject purposefully, with intention, and it's treated with the severity it deserves. This is literally, like, and as fucked up as it is, at least the villain in that scene, in that area, had a logic he was following. He wasn't, there's a literal cloud of zombie birds descending on my caravan while a army of 200 zombie children are charging us. I'm gonna go rape that 14-year-old. Like, look, I don't know what else I'm supposed to say here. Look, my script is empty past this point. What else was I supposed to say? At this point, I gave up on the book. At this point, there was nothing else to talk about. Because at this point, I was done. It took everything in my power to finish this book, and nothing justifies it. Not that anything could justify the way he uses this, but nothing. It is not worth the read. In fact, I am so angry at the time I spent reading this book that I just want my goddamn time back. You know what? I don't recommend anyone reading this. You know what? Maybe if you're a super hardcore, edgy zombie lover, and for some reason this kind of thing doesn't disgust you to the point you don't want to read it anymore, fine. Have at it. But just no for me. This is a flat no. I'm giving it a 3 out of 10. Like I said, I don't recommend this. I didn't even like it. I didn't have very much fun making this review because of the subjects I had to discuss while making the review. I just think that when it's all said and done, this wasn't worth the read. Not only will I be tossing this, well, it's actually probably closer to this, into Mount Doom, I'm going to be throwing this in there too. Because I don't want to read that. This one gave me no reason to go to that one. And honestly, that's all I have to say. Just remember, with every book comes an adventure. And there's some times where you don't need to go on the adventure, guys. Just put the book down. That sounds awful coming from me, but see you later, everyone.